It began where the salt met the grass. In the spring of 845 AD, the tide along the Frankish coast turned black. What looked like driftwood at first became the outlines of ships, long, narrow, low to the water. They moved without sails, their oars cutting silence into the river mist. Each hull carried a dozen men, bare arms marked by rope scars, faces wrapped in salt and smoke. They had no banners, only shields that flashed red when the sun broke through. The sound they made was not shouting, not singing, just the deep pulse of oars striking water in perfect time. 700 seafarers from the north. They had crossed the sea in a single line, following the gulls and the tide, moving faster than wind or warning. No one in Francia had ever seen ships move this far inland. No one thought they could. But the rivers of Europe were not borders. They were doors. The first villages saw them at dawn. Fishermen stopped rowing and stared as the shapes slid past, silent as clouds, heavy with men and iron. Children ran through fields shouting that the sea was coming. By midday, the sky had filled with smoke. That day, the rivers carried more than water. They carried fear. Upstream, the monks of Rouen rang their bells until the ropes burned. They thought the sound might hold back the wind, but the wind brought the smell of tar and blood. Before nightfall, the first monastery was ash, its relics scattered through the reeds. The ships turned upriver and vanished into the dusk. By the time the news reached Paris, it had already changed shape, from rumor to panic to truth. The north had come south, and Europe was about to learn how far the sea could travel in one endless summer. They were not soldiers, not in the way the Franks or Romans had known them. They were seafarers, farmers when the soil thawed, killers when it froze. Men who had learned that life on land was brief, but a man on a longship could outlive his name. Their world was a chain of fjords and storms, mountains that bled waterfalls into gray seas, summers that lasted only long enough to build, and winters that taught patience sharper than hunger. In those dark months, they carved oars, mended sails, and waited for the ice to break. When it did, the north emptied itself southward. The ships they built were not made for oceans. They were made for rivers. Light, shallow, with hulls that bit the water just enough to move fast and leave no wake. Each one could be dragged across land, lifted over rapids, turned by hand if the river bent too tight. A single ship could vanish into a forest and reappear 50 miles inland before anyone knew it had come. They carried no siege towers, no heavy weapons, only axes, spears, and the courage that comes from having nothing else. Each man could row, fight, steer, and burn. They slept sitting upright, ate from their shields, and kept the same rhythm whether it was storm or silence. When they rowed, the sound became a language. When they stopped, the silence was its punctuation. They called themselves Vikings, but the word did not mean what it would later. It was not a nation. It was an action. To go on a Viking was to leave what you owned behind, to take what the gods allowed you to reach. That summer, 700 of them gathered in the harbors of the north, some from Denmark, some from Norway, some from the scattered islands of the Baltic. No king commanded them. They followed men whose names would not survive, captains known only for speed, for luck in weather, for knowing where the next river began. They sailed not for conquest, but for movement itself. The rivers of Europe were unguarded, their towns built on trade, their monasteries fat with silver and parchment. It was a world waiting to be read by men who did not know how to write. Each day they moved inland, rivers splitting, widening, merging again. They followed the current as if following time in reverse, from the salt of the sea to the green silence of the continent. They did not speak of empire. They spoke of distance, of how far the oars could carry them before the world learned what had arrived. By the second week, they had left the tide behind. The gulls were gone. The trees grew close over the water. And for the first time, Europe could no longer tell where the sea had ended. The rivers of Europe were veins of forgotten empire. They carried wine, grain, stone, and now steel. To the Romans, they had once been maps of order. To the Franks, they were boundaries. To the Vikings, they were invitations. From the North Sea, the Seine curved like a coiled serpent through the land of the Franks. Further east, the Rhine cut through forests so dense they swallowed sunlight. The Elbe, the Loire, the Meuse, each one a road of liquid glass, each one leading to a heart that no army guarded. The people who lived along their banks believed the water made them safe. They thought invasion would come by road or by sea. They never imagined both could be the same thing. The longships moved with the tide until the tide disappeared. Then the men rowed hour after hour, their blades cutting dark crescents into the surface. They followed bends that wound through farmland and smoke. They passed villages where children pointed and crossed themselves, where priests dropped their books and ran for the bell ropes. Each turn of the river brought the world closer to its own reflection, the mirror of fire waiting in the distance. Sometimes they rowed under moonlight, their hulls hidden in mist so thick it made torches useless. They listened for dogs, for voices, for the sound of hooves. When they heard none, they moved faster. When they saw light on the water, they drifted, silent as clouds, until the fire they found belonged to someone else. Then they fed it. The rivers became corridors of sound, the low chant of oars, the hiss of water against wood, and the crack of fire echoing behind them. Everywhere they went, word spread upstream faster than the ships could travel, that the north had found its way inside the land. And yet, the further they went, the less they needed to burn. The threat alone opened doors. Monasteries sent tribute before the smoke reached them. Gold, silver, wine, anything to keep the horizon empty. The Vikings accepted it, then moved on. They were merchants of fear now, selling safety to those who could not buy time. In less than a month, they had moved farther inland than any northern army before. 3,000 miles of rivers and tributaries, from the salt of the Channel to the heart of Francia. No walls, no gates, no legions to stop them. Only the current, steady and cold, pulling them deeper into a continent that had forgotten how to listen for oars. When they reached the wide bend near Paris, the men stood in their ships and looked back at the smoke of 100 villages. Behind them, the rivers shimmered like molten iron. Before them, another current waited, not of water, but of history. They did not yet know it, but that summer would not end where it began. It would end where the rivers stopped moving and the land itself learned to fear the sound of the sea. They reached Rouen at dawn. The mist was low and gold from the rising sun. The bells of the city had just begun to ring for morning prayer when the sound changed, the steady beat of oars echoing against the river walls. From the towers, the guards saw the first ships, thin shadows gliding through the fog, so quiet that for a moment they seemed part of the water itself. No one believed they could be enemies. The Franks thought the sea was too far away, the rivers too narrow, the distance too deep. But then the sails rose, striped red and white like blood in linen, and the horizon caught fire. The Vikings came in two lines. Each longship carried 40 men. Each man carried a torch, a blade, and silence. They rowed until the oars struck stone, then stepped out onto the riverbank like men returning home. No drums, no horns, no shouting. Just the rhythm of boots on wet cobble and the first door breaking open. Rouen fell before the sun cleared the clouds. The city's streets were narrow, its walls too old. By midday, the flames climbed higher than the cathedral spire. Monks tried to drag relics to the river, their hands black with soot, their eyes fixed on the silver that melted before they could touch it. The wind carried their chants out over the water, but the river answered with smoke. In the same hour, the ships split, some turning west, others east toward Paris. They left nothing to hold them back. The first city to burn was not a victory. It was a message that the rivers could no longer be trusted, that the north was not coming. It was already here. Villages downstream saw the fire before the news. Ash floated past on the current, flakes of wood and parchment, pages from a Bible that drifted past fishermen who dared not touch them. At night, the horizon glowed faintly, and the people said it was the reflection of hell. When the longships rejoined days later, their decks were heavy with silver and silence. They did not speak of what they had done. They rowed upstream into lands where no one yet knew their names. But the water carried the memory faster than any word could travel. By the time they reached Paris, the river was a black mirror. Every town they passed had already emptied. Doors hung open, churches abandoned mid-prayer. The air smelled of wet ash and fear. Even the dogs no longer barked. The Vikings did not need to burn another city to be remembered. They had shown Europe its reflection, a world built beside water, believing the tide would never climb this high. They had proven that rivers could be roads, that the sea could move without waves, and that silence, when carried far enough inland, could sound exactly like war. Paris was not ready for an enemy that could vanish. The Franks had fought armies before, armies that marched, that needed roads, supply lines, horses. But these invaders came like weather. They appeared, burned, and were gone before the riders could even saddle their mounts. By the time warnings reached one garrison, the ships were already 2 rivers away. Emperor Charles the Bald ordered defenses raised along the Seine, bridges fortified, watchtowers built, river gates chained. But walls meant nothing when the enemy floated past them. The Vikings could turn their ships sideways, drop their masts, and drift under the very gates meant to stop them. They used the river itself as camouflage. And when the Franks gave chase, they found only smoke. The empire tried to fight them like soldiers. But how do you fight men who never stand still? Each time the Frankish cavalry approached, the longships simply moved away, carried by the current, oars dipping once, twice, and the horizon swallowing them whole. They did not defend territory because they claimed none. They came for movement, for the sound of oars, for the shimmer of silver, for the promise that somewhere upriver, the world was still unguarded. The Franks called them devils. Priests called them punishment. But the truth was simpler. They were men who had learned to fight gravity. While the empire depended on land, they had turned water into a weapon. Every tributary, every stream, every bend became an escape route. It was not conquest, it was momentum. In the royal halls of Aachen, the king's advisors argued about strategy. They spoke of levies, taxes, alliances, but no one could agree on how to catch an enemy made of distance. By the time their maps were drawn, the rivers had already changed. The invaders were a day ahead, sometimes a week, and every line of ink was already outdated. As summer deepened, the empire began to pay instead of fight. Bags of silver left on riverbanks, tribute disguised as peace offerings. The Vikings took them, bowed mockingly toward the distant palaces, and then came back the next season for more. They learned the price of every monastery, every town, every frightened king. Europe was becoming a marketplace of fear, and they were its most trusted merchants. In less than 2 months, 700 Vikings had done what no army had managed in a century. They had humiliated an empire without ever holding a battlefield. They proved that speed could replace strength, that geography could be turned inside out, and that rivers, once the empire's arteries, could carry its own undoing. By the end of that summer, Paris stood untouched but surrounded by smoke. The king's messengers spoke of peace, the soldiers whispered of ghosts, and the rivers kept moving, carrying with them the reflection of fire and the sound of oars fading into distance, a rhythm no one in Francia could forget. The summer did not end. It stretched, swollen with heat and distance, until even the rivers seemed to sweat. The Vikings called it the endless voyage, though no one remembered who first said it. What had begun as a raid was now a migration. Each dawn brought another horizon, another village, another reflection of fire across the water. They followed the Seine until it forked into silence. They followed the Loire until the current grew too shallow, then lifted their ships onto wooden rollers and dragged them across the mud to the next river. It took a day. The world behind them burned slower than they moved. The Franks stopped chasing them. They no longer knew where to look. To the soldiers, it felt like fighting the wind. You could see its work. You could smell it, but you could never strike it. Every message sent downstream arrived too late. Every prayer sent upward returned unanswered. The Vikings no longer counted the miles. They measured the summer by the number of nights they slept beneath foreign stars. The air thickened with insects and smoke. Food rotted faster than it could be eaten. Men grew lean, their beards streaked with ash. Their armor dulled from salt and rain. Yet the oars kept moving, each stroke an answer to hunger, each river another line in a map that had never been drawn. In the evenings they camped on river islands, their ships pulled halfway ashore like sleeping beasts. They roasted what they found: fish, grain, sometimes cattle, sometimes nothing. There were no speeches, no songs, just the hiss of fire and the slow sound of water against hulls. They no longer spoke of home. They were somewhere between places, a people defined by motion. By late August, the air had turned heavy. Storms rose from the west and broke across the valleys. The rivers swelled, carrying the wreckage of burned towns downstream. Sometimes the debris struck the longships, bits of roof, fragments of icons, the carved face of a saint drifting upside down. The men barely looked. They had seen enough gods die that summer. Word spread faster than their sails could catch wind. To the south, whole villages abandoned the riverbanks. Carts creaked inland, loaded with relics and children. Churches buried their treasures in the fields, then prayed for rain to hide the disturbed earth. But the rain came too late, and the ships had already passed. The summer ended only when the light changed, when the sun set lower and the nights began to smell of wood smoke and cold. By then, the Vikings had reached the heart of the continent, 3,000 miles from where the tide first turned black. They had crossed a world without borders. They had turned geography into a weapon, and in doing so, they had changed it forever. When the last fires dimmed on the horizon, the rivers returned to their color, but the people who lived beside them never did. Every ripple on the water sounded like an oar. Every mist looked like smoke. And when the wind shifted at dusk, they still listened for the sea. Because they knew, somewhere beyond the bend, the summer was not yet over. By the time the ships turned north again, the rivers had changed their voices. The water ran slower, heavy with ash and memory. Villages no longer burned. There was nothing left that could. The men rowed through silence. No bells, no birds, only the whisper of wood against current. The endless summer had become autumn. The nights stretched longer, the air colder. Mist clung to the hulls like breath, and the stars above them blurred in the smoke. For the first time in months, they began to look behind. They passed the ruins of churches, black ribs of stone jutting from the earth, fields that once fed empires now fed only crows. The same rivers that had carried them in triumph now reflected the emptiness they had left behind. In the still water, the flames seemed to burn backward, the past replaying itself in silence. No chronicler wrote of what they felt, because no one asked. These men were not poets. They had no language for remorse, only for survival. But some must have felt it, the strange quiet that follows too much victory, the realization that there is no sound left to conquer. When they reached the sea again, the horizon looked unfamiliar. The waves rose higher than they remembered, as if the ocean itself had changed while they were gone. They hauled their ships onto the sand and watched the tide breathe against the keels. For weeks, the salt would not leave their clothes. It clung to them like the memory of smoke. The Franks rebuilt. The monks wrote their chronicles in trembling ink. They called the invaders demons and the rivers cursed. But history is quieter than that. It records not fire, but what remains after. In the decades that followed, walls rose along the riverbanks. Bridges grew teeth of iron. The North learned to fortify against itself. And yet, in every story told after, there lingered a single unending image of ships that moved like shadows through the dawn, and of men whose silence was more terrifying than war. No one knew what became of them all. Some say they sailed east into fog and never returned. Others say they built villages deep inland, their blood mixing with the very people they once burned. But the truth is simpler. They became part of the water. Every tide that rises on a northern coast still carries their reflection. Every gust of cold wind still smells faintly of ash. And somewhere, between the sea and the sky, the smoke of that endless summer still drifts, thin, gray, and waiting for light. The rivers remember, the fire does not fade. Subscribe for the next forgotten war. And tell me, which lost empire still haunts you?